Good morning. Thank you all for being here. I apologize for being slightly late. I could have planned better. You never plan for people in front of you to have a massive collision. I don't you don't start the day thinking that'll slow me down. But anyway, thank you for being here. We have a glorious day today. For those of you who were here yesterday, I'm glad you're back. Yesterday, we started with a focus on the link between environmental justice and climate change, with a spotlight on the Caribbean to focus on exactly how the particular areas of the country, of the world, will have specific kinds of problems, but that they're linked directly to the institutions that support the ways in which we respond. So we talked about finance yesterday. We will talk about finance today in many ways. When you start to think about capital flows around the world and how that affects development and the impact of development over time, and how that has created special hazards for various parts of the world, I hope we will explore some of that today. And we'll continue it by looking at some of the specific systems within the global environmental network. I want to, before we start, I normally save this for the end, but I'm going to start the day with it. I'd like to thank Kristen, who's been pulling the rowing oar on getting this done, and I didn't want it to wait for it till the end. I also want to thank all of the volunteers who make the day happen, and all of our co-sponsors, as well as Graciela Chichelnitsky, who provided the initial funding for this conference 3 years ago, I think. Is that right? 5 years ago? 4 years ago, I'll get it right. Right, 4 years ago. And so I didn't want to save that to the end. I wanted to start the day with that, because without their work, none of this would have happened. And I hope that you have an enlightening day. So I'd like to introduce Hiʻilei Hobart, who will lead the panel on security and sovereignty in the global food systems. Professor Hobart is a professor of Native and Indigenous Studies here at Yale. She's an interdisciplinary scholar and researches and teaches in areas of settler colonialism, environment, and indigenous sovereignty. Her first book, Cooling the Tropics, Ice, Indigeneity, and Hawaiian Refreshments, is the recipient of the Duke University Press's Scholar of Color First Book Award. Her articles have appeared in refereed journals such as Nice Media and Environment, Food, Culture, and Society, the Journal of Transnational American Studies, among others. She's the co-editor of the special issues Racial Care for Social Text in 2020, and the editor of Foodways of Hawaii, Routledge, 2018. She is currently working on a project about cultural memory, commemoration, and hauntings in Hawaiian state parks. Professor Hobart holds a PhD in food studies from NYU and an MA in studies in the decorative arts and design and culture from the Bard Graduate Center, and an MLS in rare books librarianship and archives management from the Pratt Institute. She joins Yale from the University of Texas at Austin, where I also came from, so I mean, I would do that, but where she was an assistant professor at anthropology. So I'd like to welcome you to the stage. Thank you. And I want to apologize to you. I've got to run out and unlock my door so people can use my office, and I'll be right back. Okay, all right.
Just a minute to set up, okay?
Turn it off.
Okay, hi, can you hear me okay? Hi, good morning, everyone. Thanks for joining us all for the panel on security, sovereignty, and the global food system. Am I correct in thinking that we have until 10:30? 10:45. Great, thanks. So I'll introduce the panel. I'll invite my fellow panelists to come up and join me up here on the stage, if that's okay. Would you mind? You come on up. We have. I'm lonely, and I'll introduce each of them in turn. Do we have Anne Vaughan?
Yep. Hello. Good morning.
Oh, joining from Zoom, of course. Thank you. So conceptually, this panel thinks about the challenges that have deeply impacted the food system over the past year, including climate change, conflict, such as a recent conflict in Ukraine and the ongoing COVID pandemic, to ask what is our best way forward? How can food systems around the world best address these ongoing challenges? What are the key shifts that need to be taken to build more resilient and just food systems? And who needs to be engaged to make these transformations possible? This panel draws from experts around the world to address these fundamental questions about the future of food and agriculture. Tania Martinez Cruz is an interdisciplinary researcher and an indigenous woman from Mexico. She holds a BSc in irrigation engineering from University Autónoma Chapingo, an MSc in agriculture and biosystems engineering at the University of Arizona, and a PhD in social sciences from Wageningen University. She is a research associate at the Laboratory of Anthropology of Contemporary Worlds of the Free University of Brussels, working across issues linked to international development in areas as diverse as sanitary engineering, irrigation, water management, energy security, food and nutrition security, ICT4D, agricultural extension, social inclusion, climate action, and the politics of knowledge. She uses her research and her experience in the field to advocate for the role of Indigenous peoples, their knowledge and practices in tackling global challenges such as water, nutrition and food security, climate change, as well as the role of Indigenous youth and women as knowledge holders and guardians of the world's biodiversity. Sabohat Ahmadkhonova is the Central Asia Poverty Project Manager of the Mountain Society Development Support Program of Aga Khan Foundation in Tajikistan. This is a project that works toward poverty alleviation and food security improvement in the remotest communities of Pamir, in areas with harsh climatic conditions and limited agricultural opportunities. Ahmadkhonova's background is in biology science, and she also has national and international experience in development for improving quality of life for communities in mountainous areas. Dr. Chika Esiobu is a researcher, teacher, nonfiction and fiction writer, and public intellectual. Dr. Esiobu holds a PhD in African Development and Policy Studies from Howard University in Washington, D.C., and is the author of Indigenous Knowledge and Education in Africa, published in 2020 by Springer. Their work centers around the significance of Africa's indigenous knowledge in the continent's idea of progress. Chika has been asked to talk about her ideas in many places, including the London School of Economics, Pan-African Parliament, United Nations Development Program, African Union, Social Science Research Council, United Nations Economic Commission for Africa, United Nations Public Service Award Ceremony, and the Standard Bank South Africa, among others. Anne Vaughan, who's joining us by Zoom. Hi, Anne. Joined the Biden-Harris administration in February 2021 and works in USAID's Bureau for the Resilience and Food Security as a senior advisor for climate change. The Bureau for Resilience and Food Security works with a host of partners to advance inclusive agriculture-led growth, resilience, nutrition and water security, sanitation and hygiene in priority countries to help them accelerate and protect development progress, including against the impacts of climate change. and is leading USAID's efforts to implement the President's Emergency Plan for Adaptation and Resilience, as well as working across RFS to elevate and integrate climate actions across the Bureau's agriculture, water, and nutrition centers, and is working to ensure USAID's new climate strategy. Prior to joining USAID, Anne worked at Mercy Corps, served as a field officer for USAID in Kandahar, Afghanistan, and as a congressional staffer working on foreign aid appropriations. She has her master's in international development studies with a focus on post-conflict reconstruction from George Washington University and an undergraduate degree from the College of William and Mary. So I think that as far as the panelists go, we'll maybe speak in the order that I introduce you in. I believe you each have 10 or so minutes, but I'll be gracious with the cutoff time. And then after that, we can, I'll have a few questions of my own for you, and then we can open it up to discussion. Tanya, I give the floor to you.
So thank you very much for the invitation. So we are living in an era of food crisis. What we're learning is that the way we produce food is not sustainable, and we cannot keep business as usual. What do we mean by that? The model that we use currently was grounded a lot on what we call the Green Revolution, where we maximize yields per unit of land, water, fertilizer. But that has also taken us to a crisis where we say that 30% of the greenhouses come from agriculture, 70% of water that is used, it's linked to agriculture, and agriculture is also responsible of the 80% of the world's deforestation. Additionally, we lose 30% of the food that we take from the field to our plates because we don't have a good management on that, and still we face food insecurity. Added to this, we rely also just in 3 major crops: maize, wheat, and rice, which account for the 60% of the caloric intake. And if we add 25 other crops, they make the 90% of the caloric intake we use. What we have learned, not only with COVID, that disrupted many food chains, is that malnourishment increased from 8.4 to 9.9 in 1 year. Added to this, our reliance on these crops and fertilizers with the current conflict in between Russia and Ukraine is making us more vulnerable. It's affecting our resilience. But is there anything that we can do? Are there other people that we can learn from? And I would say yes, indigenous peoples, who account for 476 million indigenous peoples around the world living in 90 countries. So you know, here, for example, in the US, you have indigenous peoples that have learned to deal with the arid conditions of the desert of Arizona. You have people in the Arctic, in the world, that have learned to live in the cold lands, or in the Amazonas, in Peru, for example, what we many times call marginal areas where you think food cannot be produced, they have learned to deal with the environment. And that's because they have developed over centuries a deep knowledge in these territories. A deep knowledge that is linked to the territories. Something that we speak about when we describe indigenous people's food systems, it's not production. We talk about food generation. What does it mean, food generation? I was mentioning the territories because we have a deep knowledge on the different seasons that we have. For example, if it's a rainy season in my community, we rely on mushrooms. If it's a dry season and there's nothing, like like the presenter said, I'm Mexican, so we rely on these traditional milpa systems, maize intercropping systems. We could use roots. If you talk to the people, Selkut people in Russia, in Siberia, they tell you in the north, there's a huge deficiency on vitamin D, and they tell you what the elders told them to eat so they can compensate for these foods. What has happened is like a lot of this knowledge has been undermined by main science policy making, because there's a deep knowledge in these territories on these different food systems, but we have failed to take them or embrace them in main policy making. I was mentioning Arizona, like the Tohonos in the driest season of the year, they harvest saguaros, which is like a cactus that they rely on, is like rich in sugar, and that's how they manage to make a living too. According to FAO, I was mentioning 28 crops that are the main ones that give the 90% of the caloric intake. Indigenous people's food systems can contain up to 250 foods. Imagine, the world relying in 25 versus 250 that can be found in just one single food system. So what we also have seen when I was talking about the role of science in policy, I'm going to refer to the example of Canada. There are some studies that reveal that the changes in diet when we have imposed some diets in Indigenous communities or local people is that they have also caused or have been negative to the health. Harriet Kuhnheim is a well-known researcher from Canada, and she's done a lot of research linking diets and how shifting patterns has affected population. She documents that younger generations that have migrated to urban areas that rely less on their territories are presenting more health issues in the present because of these switches in diet. So we have to think what is that we have done. And I will give you another example. I was working in the Peruvian Amazon a couple of years ago, and one indigenous leader told me that the thing that happens with you people, scientists and policymakers, is that you don't listen and you don't look at what we have. So they have some worms that they call suris, and they use them as a sacred food, but also it's nutritious. And he took some of these to the Minister of Social Development and put them on the table, like saying, I got you a present. The Minister of Social Development screamed and said, what do you want me to do with these worms? Like saying, yuck, right? And then he was like, that's the way we feel when you bring food and you try to impose food on us. Because many times when we're designing policy or we're making recommendations as scientists, we don't think what is available there. And we end up like portraying some crops that might not be feeding these territories. So this is just to say, but why is that we have undermined these different ways of knowledge, these different food systems? We have what is called traditional ecological knowledge, indigenous knowledge. And the way this knowledge is passed through one generation to other is through orality. It's systematic, but it just doesn't work probably in the same logic like where we register in a book. We are told that we have to run a statistical analysis to validate information. But the proof that many of these systems are sustainable is like these people are still alive and they have techniques that are impressive to some. Let me go to another example in the Mixteca Alta in Oaxaca, Mexico. I make a joke and the religious people have to forgive me. I say, there's a saying in Spanish that it says, when you see like a really challenging environment, you say God didn't pass there. So that region is super arid. And they used a system that is called maíz de cajete, which means they have used the native seeds and they put seeds deep enough, 30 centimeters, to use what we call residual humidity. If that's not knowledge, tell me then what it is that has allowed many of these people to survive. What they also do, because there's not enough rainfall, they put seeds along the streams, the intermediate streams when it's like a rainy period, so that they have managed to get their foods. Why is this also so relevant? I was making the link to territories, but also there's a role of indigenous languages, because that's how we kept a lot of this knowledge, passing it from one generation to other. We have the decade of indigenous language now that UNESCO is been promoting, and we say a language dies. But I would say that from the grassroots perspectives, we don't say language die, we kill them. And we kill them when we kill the people that keeps them alive, which is people. Every year, we have approximately 250 people that dies or it's murdered defending territories because of the land grabbings. 60% of them work on indigenous issues and 30% of them are directly indigenous peoples. Why is this happening? Because I forgot to mention also, sorry, I mentioned the number of indigenous peoples around the world, but they are the custodians, or people say they are the custodians of 80% of the world's biodiversity in less than 25% of the world's surface. So there's like a lot of attraction to these areas, even though it seems to be a small portion. And I say that if we kill indigenous peoples, if we displace them, we are also killing our planet because we are killing this ability to be resilient in the world. We were talking also about, or one of the questions that I was posed is like, what happened with COVID? I would give you some examples that also when we tend to talk about indigenous people's food systems, we undermine. In my community or many of the communities I work with, the idea when COVID hit of an individual quarantine wasn't acceptable because many of these societies are collective. So what many of these societies did was to enclose their communities. There was one community where I used to work with an old lady. She's 80 years old and I was concerned. She doesn't crop her land anymore, but she assured me when I talked to her by the phone and when I spoke to other people that because of this collective culture, they would look after each other. And she said, I have my neighbors that come and feed me. I have my neighbors that come every day and make sure I'm okay. When many of the prices on basic foods also went up, for example, in my community, the authorities made sure to put some measurements so people wouldn't abuse and increase the prices, because that was the collective feeling of looking after each other. So when I talk about indigenous people's food systems, yes, it's about the territory, it's about the knowledge, it's about the languages, it's about the biodiversity and the richness, but also about many other values that many times we are losing as a society. The other question was like, what is that we're doing? So I'm affiliated now with the Free University of Brussels, but I'm also part of something that we have initiated at FAO that is called the Global Hub on Indigenous People's Food Systems. And last year, no, 2 years ago, no, it was last year, sorry, I'm messing up with the dates. We had a United Nations Food Systems Summit and we managed to get a coalition on indigenous people's food systems. One of our premises is like anything that has to be done with indigenous peoples, and if it's involving food systems too, has to be done and led by indigenous peoples. And that's something that we were working with. With the Global Hub has been also that we need to gather experiences from indigenous, non-indigenous researchers to make progress advocating for indigenous peoples. Thank you. Sorry, I extended it.
Thank you, Tanya. Sabahat, I'll give you the floor.
Dear conference organizers, dear panelists, dear attendees, thank you very much. It's my immense pleasure to be here today. Thank you again for this opportunity. Before starting my speech, I would like to pay the audience attention to a short video which illustrates the place where I come from and the organization which I'm representing today is working on a daily basis. Please. Thank you. This is Pamir's, Gorno-Badakhshan Autonomous Oblast of Tajikistan, which is located in an altitude of 2,000 to 4,000 meters. And it has a lot of limitations, including agricultural limitations, land limitations, limitations related to food security, sovereignty, and climate change and resilience limitations, and many, many other constraints which we face daily in our life in this region. For much of Pamir's history, its relative isolation has meant indigenous trees, wheat, herbal medicines, and ways of farming and raising of animals. It has developed, by the way, specific to this location. Mountain Society's Development Support Program, we call it MSDSP, it is the project of Aga Khan Foundation, Tajikistan, which is one of the leading organizations in my region, and one of the best partners of the government in the region, which is dealing with these challenges on a daily basis, with the challenges which our communities are facing. And we are supporting the marginalized community through both internal and external funding, including tremendous support received from the United States Agency for International Development. This is also our constant partner, and we are working with USAID continuously. MSDSP is working at the grassroots level in different dimensions, including food security and community resilience to climate change. The organization, besides its planned projects, it also tracks the global changes. For instance, the recent pandemic of COVID, the conflicts which are going on around the world, and another instabilities and other challenges which have determinantal implications on our communities and the resilience of our communities. And the organization in this way also designs the need-based projects to address these particular issues. One of the prominent food security related projects of MSDSP is Central Asia Poverty Project, which I'm dealing with. And to be mentioned that this project is focused mainly on the people who comes under poverty, the poorest people of the population. And this project is funded by His Highness the Aga Khan, and it is operating for around 5 years. CAP project builds community assets that directly address food security and climate resilience challenges in rural remote areas through very basic ways, like provision of access to new lands through restoring construction of irrigation systems. We are making crop diversification available in our region through introducing resistance seeds varieties. We are establishing a sustainable basic mechanisms for provision of sustainable access to certified agricultural inputs, which is a big challenge for our region as well. And we are creating a climate resilient assets such as storage facilities, greenhouses, shelters for livestock, and many, many others. All this, of course, it leads to improved food security and enhanced livelihoods. Nevertheless, although the practices applied to date are generating positive results, we are cognizant of the fact that due to the rapid changes of impact of climate change, the practices may get obsolete. Therefore, MSDSP of Aga Khan Foundation has aspiration to achieve further sustainability of the rural communities by applying best international practices in building communities' resilience to climate change. Hence, the organization is open to cooperate with any research institute, including a US-based institute on food security and nutrition, just to explore the potential sustainable opportunities that may be applicable and scaled up in the rural communities of Tajikistan and GBO in particular. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you, Sabuhat. I'll turn the floor over to Chika.
Thank you, Hiʻilei. I wish to thank the organizers of this event for making this possible. And I want to thank every one of us present here today. If you will permit me to start, I will tell a short story before I go through my presentation. When I was about 10 years my father came home one day and said he went for medical checkup, and the doctors told him he had high cholesterol and should watch his diet. And so he said the doctors advised him to stop eating a particular traditional delicacy that we would get easily from the farm. And now we will have to buy vegetable oil for him to cook with. So instead of the palm oil, I'm from Nigeria, the West African palm oil that grew wildly, it still grows wildly around the region, which we used to cook. He said, doctors said that's not good for you to cook with. You have to go to the market, buy the imported vegetable oil, and use that to make your food. And we were hurt as kids. We loved that delicacy. But then what to do? So we had to go buy vegetable oil from the stores, imported vegetable oil to cook. Although my mom would cook that delicacy for us sometimes with the palm oil, but for the most part, we had to spend money now to buy that vegetable oil for my dad to help his cholesterol. So imagine my shock when I grew up to learn that that vegetable was partially hydrogenated vegetable oil that doctors advised and still advise against, and that palm oil actually is much more nutritional than, I mean, of course, you can't place both of them side by side. A lot of research has gone into that palm oil that my dad was banned from eating by the very helpful medical practitioner. And that brings me to today's presentation. I would like to talk about how can we make food systems more resilient in the face of ongoing disruptions, talking of climate, COVID, and conflict. And my quick response to that, Tanya, you did a lot of justice to what I wanted to say, so I'll probably just focus on Africa and just bring it down home a little bit more. But thank you for that presentation. And one rarely talked about cause of food insecurity across the world today is the gradual but consistent decline in dietary diversity. I will here make a case for a decolonization of taste buds in order to restore indigenous foods and indigenous agricultural practices to their place of prominence in order to reduce dependency on imported mechanisms, imported inputs that destroy climate, is expensive to sustain, and really end up taking nations and communities further down in terms of food security and making the climate worse. Perhaps nowhere are the effects of the overthrow of the indigenous food system more evident today than in African countries, where a reduction in the importation of wheat as a result of the war in Ukraine has brought about hunger and starvation. Wheat is a crop that 50 years ago was not a major part of the diets of many Africans. In 1970, Kenya, Tanzania, and Uganda produced more wheat than the population cared to consume. They didn't care much about wheat, bread, biscuits, chapati, sambosa, and all of that. They had so many indigenous food options to choose from: millet, corn, maize, yam, cocoyam, and wheat wasn't an issue. They were looking to export wheat at that time. Of course, we know that around that period, just before that time that Uganda, Tanzania, and Kenya wanted to export wheat, colonization actually stigmatized traditional African cuisine and made it look primitive and unhealthy. People were told, even educators, medical doctors, nutritionists were told, with little research done into these indigenous food systems, that they were not healthy. You know, they should go for the options that today the West is asking people to not pursue anymore. And these people were told that the imported, expensive Western foods were better in both taste and nutrition. Many Africans, particularly the middle class, began to make such colonial foods a major part of their diet. It was a status symbol. You were supposed to be educated and enlightened if you eat vegetable oil instead of palm oil, if you eat some of these processed foods instead of the natural foods your fathers and your grandfathers ate. And the colonial authorities and other countries of the global north were quick to cash in on the acquired African tastes for wheat and began to export wheat and even dump excess wheat production on the continent of Africa. Africa's disdain, disrespect, and disregard for indigenous foods translated into a loathing of farming. Africans who previously proudly cultivated their land with respect and dignity began to regard farming as a backward enterprise. Many citizens chose life in unsanitary, congested, poorly planned cities where they competed for scarce white-collar employment. Colonialism ended decades ago, but as we heard yesterday, it is still ongoing. Africans are still struggling to reconnect with their taste buds. But it is no longer optional. The persistent and critical food shortages in the region are indications that Africa and the rest of the global south and indigenous communities that Tanya mentioned should wean its palate from the colonial era appetites it has carried with it ever since, and instead focus on developing innovative uses for traditional foods, and also have this regard and respect for traditional cultivation systems. Curbing the taste bud of indigenous communities of Africa, of the global north, should be a matter of policy and policy making and implementation across these areas. There is a potential for growth and advancement if citizens focus on indigenous foods. There is need to institutionalize efforts aimed at a decolonization of taste buds towards a dietary diversity that focuses on indigenous foods. Indigenous foods natural to different communities across the world should be emphasized in research and development, in academia, as we're doing today. Many African governments and governments of the global south have tried to scale up farming through the importation of technology and agricultural additives, such as pesticides and fertilizers. These have over and over failed to generate the much desired green revolution. Not to mention the extremely high contributions of fertilizer, pesticides, and other such inputs to greenhouse gas emissions. Scientists have shown that Africa's native foods, indigenous people's native foods of the global south can grow very well with little or no additives, of the dangerous chemicals and all the technology that we know cause what we are trying to reverse today by way of climate change. And rather than a focus on machines and synthetic agricultural inputs, governments should focus on people. Governments of the global south should focus on people. In the case of Africa, for instance, the population is a hugely beneficial factor. And we talk of scaling out agriculture, bringing in more people into agriculture, which was the practice, back in the day. It was a responsibility for people to grow their own food. It was not outsourced. It's like taking care of yourself. You will grow your own food no matter at what scale. So it's just to get people back to that place where that recognition, that respect, that value and dignity is given to farming and to producing food that you eat with respect for the effects on the environment and on future generations. And if a large number of jobless and underemployed people in urban areas take up farming and the processing of indigenous foods, it will have a snowball effect on other sectors. Innovations centered on Africa's indigenous food system will conserve the environment, it will drastically reduce food insecurity, and it will herald much of the formerly colonized world and world countries of the global south into an era of unparalleled prosperity. Thank you for your time.
Thank you, Chika. Anne, I give you the floor.
Great. Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Great. Well, thank you so much. It's wonderful to be with you all today, and I'm really sad not to be in person and get to sit with such an amazing group of panelists today. It's but still great to hear what you've all said, and I think that there's some real excited about our discussion because there's some really exciting topics we can dig into. And there's a couple stories that I've just heard that we'll have to take back and share with my colleagues here, because really appreciate all of the perspectives from the panel. I thought I might take just a few minutes to highlight what USAID or US Agency for International Development is doing in regards to food systems, highlight the threats to food security that we've talked about a bit, but share a couple numbers that are really concerning to us, and then also how we're trying to address these threats, including through elevating our work with historically marginalized populations, including Indigenous people, women, and youth. So to take a bit of a step back, USAID leads the US government's Feed the Future initiative, which combats the root causes of hunger, poverty, and malnutrition through investments that strengthen inclusive agricultural-led growth, resilience, and nutrition. Now, interestingly, Feed the Future was born out of the 2007-2008 global spike in food prices, so over a decade ago, to try to address the threats that were under, that people were under, again, over 10 plus years ago. And have worked to really focus our attention on addressing hunger and poverty through Feed the Future. And we're excited that we're able to, through this focus, have helped able to lift 23.4 million people to live above the poverty line. 3.4 million children are living free of stunting, and about 5.2 million more families are not hungry. And the average pace of stunting reduction has been 2.5 times higher annually in the Feed the Future, what we call target countries, and before Feed the Future began. So we have some good news when we focus on food systems and working with people to address hunger. But as noted by other panelists right now, we are facing some extreme challenges and need to improve food security in a sustainable, inclusive manner to be able to address these challenges. I think as noted, the food security challenge is staggering. In last year, 2021, there were 193 million people worldwide that were facing acute food insecurity, highest number on record, and it was driven largely by how we frame it, called the 3 Cs. We've got the climate crisis, the COVID pandemic, and conflict. And can't underscore enough how President Putin's unjustified invasion of Ukraine and its impact on the price of food, fuel, and fertilizer, as well as Ukrainian farmers' ability to export their crops, has really exacerbated an already dire situation and could increase the number of food insecure and extremely poor people by an estimated 40 million people by the end of this year. And just, I wanted to make sure we also note, as our last speaker was talking about, in Africa, we're really concerned about in the Horn of Africa, there's been 4 consecutive seasons of failed rain that has decimated local food production. We have almost over 200,000 Somalis are at risk of starvation, and some 7.1 million Somalis, or nearly half the population are facing acute levels of food insecurity. And most frustrating, very frustratingly about all of this, especially the climate impacts on smallholder farmers and families around the world, is that those suffering the most from the impacts of the climate crisis are also those who have contributed the least to creating the crisis. And another frustrating point is young women and girls are also generally disproportionately impacted by the climate crisis, as they are most vulnerable to natural hazards. They're pushed often into child marriage and face significantly higher mortality rates due to the lower access to and control of resources such as shelter and food. So shifting and thinking about how we fix this, we think we need sustained and long-term investments that promote more equitable and sustainable food systems. And we think this effort is embodied in the US government's Feed the Future initiative, where I've talked about some of the impact we've had over the last 10 years, but am excited to share how USAID has been shaping and changing some of our policies to make sure that they are more inclusive, including, I'll start with our global food security strategy, which we released, I think we're almost on a year anniversary or so, which really highlights the importance of inclusion and working with marginalized populations, and looking at a gendered and inclusive development specific approach. As we know, all of these impacts on food systems can impact individuals with a variety of identities, especially those from most marginalized communities. So things that we're elevating and working on in our new strategy for the food security strategy is on social and legal gender norms to make sure we're granting greater access to and control over resources for both women and girls, so we can make sure our interventions are based on the context of diverse communities. We've also done a lot, and I'll speak a little bit more about our work on Indigenous peoples. We've just recently, in June of this year, also released Indigenous People Strategy that we're happy to talk more about in the questions and answer, that we think helps elevate everything that we've just heard from the other panelists about respecting and listening to Indigenous people's knowledge and making sure that we're elevating the leadership of Indigenous people. I think there's a very good point and quote about the people of color that are the most impacted by environmental problems. And they're the least represented in positions of power. And we're taking efforts both in the Indigenous Peoples strategy as well as through our climate change strategy to really elevate the work and voices of Indigenous people. And just to name a couple points about our climate strategy. Sorry, I'm ticking through all of our strategies, but I want to demonstrate how we're trying to integrate the importance of better inclusive development, and how we do that at USAID is we set strategies and policies, and then we try to it helps shift the ship of our bureaucracy to make sure we're doing what we say and we put on paper are doing. So just to flag, as part of our climate change strategy, it's calling on all corners of our agency to empower youth, women, Indigenous people, and others to lead on climate action, which is, we know, closely linked with food systems. And one of the things that we're trying to do is elevate Indigenous people, and we have a target of working in over 40 countries to make sure we're working closely in empowering Indigenous populations, and have an explicit reference to protecting environmental defenders too, which I think one of the earlier panelists noted the threat that many Indigenous people face when they are just trying to defend their way of life and come under death threats and worse. So we're excited that our policies are working to address some of these issues, and are working feverishly on the ground in our missions around the world to help address these issues, because, again, as noted, the food system is under considerable threat. It's hurting the most marginalized and poor and vulnerable among the world's population, and we need to make sure we are energized to really address these problems and take on and listen closely to our partners on the ground, the people on the ground who are most impacted, as they always generally know what the right solutions are to address these problems and improve food security so they can feed themselves and their family. I may stop there because I know we're supposed to have a robust discussion, but really, again, appreciate the panelists' comments and looking forward to the conversation.
Thank you to all of the panelists for sharing your deep knowledge. It's a great honor to be in conversation with you all. I have a couple of my own questions, but I will prompt the audience to take a moment and think about what their questions might be so that we can all engage in conversation together. So my first question, in looking back to the general prompt for the panel, is thinking about really, what are some of the acute issues that communities appear to be grappling with right now. But when it comes to acute issues, I always think about the work of the Anishinaabe intellectual Leanne Simpson, who writes that the monster has arrived and the monster was always here. And keeping that in mind, I'm wondering, how do we think about navigating issues that might at first blush seem new, but are in fact the result of centuries of imperialism, indigenous dispossession, extractivism, and racial capitalism, affected largely by the Western world? In other words, what is the temporal frame that we might use to think not only about solutions, but also how we might think about the shape or perhaps the depth of the issues around food security and sovereignty?
That's a really challenging question. What I can tell you is I was mentioning the Global Hub on Indigenous Peoples Food System that we launched in 2020 with FAO. A lot of what I said is like we need to engage knowledge in a more respectful way, but also like we need to engage. I work with a lot with educational initiatives because I feel like, I'm gonna go around. I was in Tajikistan just recently with a water decade event, and everyone was talking about meaningful inclusion. Everyone was like saying we need to include indigenous peoples, youth. But then I asked them, and where are indigenous peoples? When they cannot be acknowledged openly in some countries because they cannot be right holders, for example, they are denied. There's a rights issue. How do we move this forward? When we say everyone loves, I worked in development for so many years and everyone loves the word participation, but what does it mean to include it in a meaningful way? I say we need more researchers, we need more people that it's having a seat at the table where many of these decisions are made. I would say I'm really happy to see that there are some scholars that come from native nations here. Sorry for the terminology, I mess up because I know it's called differently from one country to other, but I think we need to bring more of these people to the table. Research. That doesn't mean like it has to be separated, and that's the idea that we have with the Global Hub. We bring indigenous and non-indigenous scholars to create not necessarily new knowledge, but to in a way bring up what is already there and try to put this in policy processes and recommendations. I was talking about a coalition on indigenous people's food systems, and I'm happy there's someone from USAID here because I will extend the invitation. We have 7 countries. We're launching the coalition next Tuesday at FAO, but we got the endorsement of 7 countries, and it was really challenging to get it because they wanted us to go and work in different streams during the UNA food systems, and we said no. We want a coalition that is led by indigenous peoples. We want the majority to come and be part of it, and we have a steering committee that brings 1 representative from each sociocultural region, and we have 7 member countries, but we want to include more. Because if we want to really tackle many of these issues, indigenous people should be there at putting or supporting these policy processes, not excluded. They should be leading them. So that's like sort of an invitation. But at the same time, I feel like we need to invest in capacity development. They need to be in academia, they need to be in policy making, and that would be my recommendation and what I feel like we're doing. And yeah, so I'm not sure if I'm contributing so much to this, but I feel like that's where we need to be doing things.
Yeah,
Thank you.
you're welcome. Yeah, thank you for that question, Hiʻilei. I think it's an interesting and necessary question because with the rise of post-coloniality, studies, postmodernism, of course, critical consciousness in the academia, we are beginning to look at these problems. Like you said, they've been there. These challenges of taking away the sovereignty of indigenous communities, indeed coercing them forcefully in many cases into focusing on Western diet. But with the rise of these questionings going on in the academia across fields, it is filtering into indigenous food systems, and thankfully we're here having this conversation. But the question to ask is, are indigenous communities ready to begin to explore their own indigenous food systems? And yesterday I had a quick conversation with the Honorable Anami of the Canadian Green Party, which she's worked extensively with First Nations in that country. And she talked about how indigenous communities will insist on certain policies that we know are detrimental to the environment because they see it as progressive. That is their own idea of progress. They want to be where the West is today. They want to be technologically advanced. So yes, the idea is how can we indeed break down this revolution going on in the academia to indigenous communities. It will take education again at the formal and informal and non-formal levels. Formal education is the curriculum of study, and non-formal documentaries, televisions, conferences, informal, what conversations are we encouraging with indigenous communities outside of this formalized spaces. It is a lot of work. Otherwise, we will find out that indigenous people, Africans, will be the very ones sabotaging the whole process of trying to reconnect, if you may, with indigenous values and indigenous systems, be it indigenous food systems or production systems. And I've been at a conference where I mentioned indigenous farming practices, and a minister of agriculture in an African country was so upset with me for trying to drag our country backwards into the woods by not looking for funds to import fertilizer and pesticides and all of that, trappings of modernity that we know today are detrimental to the environment. So it will take a lot of work to educate and enlighten the masses on that. Thank you. Yeah.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
And our several hats.
I wouldn't add much to this topic because I'm a bit far from this kind of at global level or at country level. But I would say that while promoting something new, yeah, we are just promoting also to forget something what was old. And the same we have in our region. We have been promoting our communities to with something, a new food or something new style of cultivation, a new crop introduction. And we are feeling that we lost what was their own practice, their traditional practice, the indigenous practice. And we see that, particularly the project which I'm working with, was established because of high stunting and wasting rate, because all these new, our people were not used to that. And that changing their diet, we have been changing their it impacted their health as well. And now we are starting to promote again, going back to that, what they had, and to promote it and to recall it and to restore that. And while my conclusion is, while doing something new and promoting something new, there should be a balance, and that should be context-based, yes? That should be contextualized, not just the same approach for all countries with no consideration of their indigenous or their specific kind of traditions.
Yeah, I love that. Thinking about things new, it should not be about forgetting.
Yeah.
Anne, you willing to take a stab?
Yeah, can I a very good, tough question. And in terms of, I might speak from sort of a donor perspective, because I think we've known that we have not always done things in the right way. And so one of the ways we've been trying to do that is to promote localization and inclusive development. And we think they're really kind of two sides of the same coin. So what localization is, and we're really excited that next Monday or Tuesday, we'll release a new policy and agenda on this front, but localization involves making intentional changes to how we work, our policies, processes, our staffing, importantly, and funding decisions to support more equitable partnerships and programs that really places local actors in the lead, including those who may otherwise have faced barriers in attempting to work with us before. And we think that's closely linked to inclusive development, what we're talking about today, which is about ensuring that our programming reaches and fully includes marginalized and underrepresented communities who may not have ever worked with us before, because there's been such bureaucratic red tape and what have you in the way from partnering with us. So, but we're working on being intentional and proactively addressing the barriers that communities and marginalized groups have faced to make sure they can work in our program and work with us. And I just wanted to flag what I think is really important is we've committed to getting 1/4 of our funds directly to local partners by fiscal year 2025, which is a pretty significant shift, and trying to shift how and work and shift power to local actors by creating space for them to exercise leadership across our program cycle. It's kind of a bureaucratic speech, but basically that's how you influence programs and how we operate, is getting into our program cycle and making sure we hear early on and can help co-create with the communities and the organizations that have have the right knowledge to be able to influence and make sure our programming is effective. So by 2030, we've set a goal of making sure at least half of our programs create this space for local leadership, which is a step change for us and means sort of doing things differently than we have in the past. Again, apologies that it's a little bureaucratic, but that's how we're hoping to change how we do business. Over.
That's very exciting. Thank you. My next question is a little bit of a broad question. And maybe it's a simple question that is deceptively complicated. So I would love to invite the panelists to talk a little bit about what food sovereignty looks like to you, and what does it look like for the communities in which you work or which you come from.
I think food sovereignty, thank you for that, Hiʻilei, would mean respect for what is local, and not a disregard and disrespect for what is accessible to people based on knowledge, actually. So not just some idealistic, if you may, compassionate, way of looking at it, but based on facts. So when the doctor advised my dad to eat hydrogenated vegetable oil as against palm oil, that's because he went to some conference and was told, that there's no, palm oil is bad, without any evidence, without any reason, without any research backing that up. So sovereignty will be allowing people to take decisions based on what is known, what is reality, and also allowing people to be educated, just as we said earlier, being able to educate indigenous peoples about the reality of indigenous food systems. In the West, it is a status symbol, more or less, to eat organic. Here, people will go to Whole Foods and buy things if they can afford it. But back in Africa, it is a status symbol to eat junk, to buy sneaker bar, to go to school with sneaker bar if you're a student, and everyone thinks you're a star. And there is no education around that, the effects of Western food on the people. So there is no sovereignty without enlightenment. There is no sovereignty without true enlightenment. And Africans indigenous people need to be enlightened that they were led astray by colonialism. They were led astray by the forceful coercion, or indeed the modeling of the eating of some of these foods and the practices. We can stay in this classroom, we talk about fertilizer, pesticides, and how harmful it is. Indigenous people want to see green leaves shooting up their land as a result of fertilizer, because that's what they've been sold for years. So how do we go back to say we were wrong? And this is let's work with you to improve what you have already. That will be sovereignty, really. Yes. Complex as that sounds, but that's that's what I believe should be the pathway to allowing people to take that decision and realize what actually is right in their own locale at this point in time. Yes.
Yeah, I appreciate that. In Hawaii, which is a settler colonial space in which the US has illegally occupied us for about 140 years, 150 years. We have been minoritized in our own land. And there has been recently, in the last 20 or so years, a robust pivot towards food sovereignty initiatives that appear to be popularly supported by a lot of people in Hawaii because our food prices are unaffordable and astronomical. Yet those same people, many would not support political sovereignty for Native Hawaiians. And I think about that tension all of the time between political sovereignty and food sovereignty in the way that they can become strategically disentangled. But I'm going off on my own tangent. Are there any other panelists that would like to talk about ideas of food sovereignty?
Yeah, I think I want to step in. I like the question, I have to say. I don't know how it might look like. There's one of my favorite phrases, and that's going to sound idealistic, from the Zapatista movement, that we should aim for a world where many other worlds fit. There are not silver bullets, but we need to give space to different voices. I feel like when we talk about food policy in general, when we talk about dams, for example, or we making like a road, there's this idea, or it's coming more regulatory, which is good, that we should be consulting people in their territories about if they want this or not, the free, prior, and informed consent. But I feel like we fail to do that when it comes to food, but also when we design food policy and nutrition policies, we can grab, we displace. And you were talking about education. We need to fully inform people. I worked in development, so I also know that many times when we intervene with a rationale and we don't think so much of the unintended consequences. I'm not justifying what we do, but I feel like sometimes when we like in the field, we aim good, but doesn't necessarily mean it translates into good. It comes with unintended consequences. So one of the communities that I love the most in Oaxaca, Mexico, I did my PhD in one of these communities, was analyzing how policies displace them or push them to stop cropping their native maize. So they started migrating to the US in a legal way. That was after the Second World War, because you needed laborers in this side of the world. But they kept on going back to Oaxaca, to the mountains, and I wonder why. So there was this attachment to culture identity, but they reduced the farming. They didn't stop farming, but they reduced the farming. They would use the maize they had and some of the foods that they needed for specific foods that were really key for to their identity. But in 2008, we had a boom of the biofuels in the US, and we depend a lot on the maize in the US and Mexico, and the exports, so that hit us really badly. So we had a tortilla crisis. Then we had a hurricane and other events in the same region the next 2 years. So the people in this little village were saying, we had money, but no food. We were not self-sufficient anymore, and they say they had to go up in the mountains to look for food, and they say we couldn't be calling ourselves farmers anymore. So they started like a hybrid system. I'm trained as an engineer, but I also keep some of my roots, and I believe like we can make hybrid worlds. But I think when we make these hybrid worlds, we need to ask and consult people, and they should be the ones making that decision. And I love the example of this community because they still use the native seeds. They've changed the planting density. When it was before, let's say 90 centimeters every plant of maize, now it's like 60. They reduce the crop density, but still keep some elements of the milpa system, which is essential for them. And they now use irrigation that they have from the sacred river to irrigate and harvest maize. Now they say they are self-sufficient, and to me, that's what we need, that communities decide. There's an influence to policy, but they should be deciding what's the way forward and how they want to move.
Hi, if I could chime in, thanks. This really good conversation on this. And I mean, just to be, I work for the Development International part of the US government. There's also separate groups that work on trade. And when it comes to how we define food sovereignty, in the trade context, sometimes it can get a bit complicated and can refer to protectionism or other restrictive import or export policies that have negative consequences for food security and sustainable and income growth. So just to sort of clarify sort of the US government position on that in trade areas is we do not want, higher barriers that then have increased prices of food and hurts poor people the most. So that's in a trade context though. In the context I think we're talking about more today, I think the choice of farmers and fisher folk and producers to be able to grow what they want, how they want it, and in a way that is able to feed their family is obviously incredibly important. And I really liked the point about information, is making sure that there's enough information that again, farmers and fishers can make the right choices for their families, feed their families and their communities as they see fit. And I wanted to, what we see is interesting and hear often, and sometimes in different sectors or different parts of the world, is sometimes young people don't want to be farmers anymore. And how do we, and this is their choice, and donors should not be pushing people to do things they don't want to do. That is not our job. We should not be doing that. But it's interesting in how do we help especially the growing youth population around the world, find or have the opportunity and the choices to do things that help create a more sustainable and an inclusive environment for them, and opportunities for them that they want to pursue as we go forward. And a lot of that does depend on, and there's a lot of different opportunities in food systems that I think are really interesting. I think Tanya mentioned in the beginning, food loss and waste earlier. That was so important, is that we're losing about 30% of food, either in production, before it gets to your table or afterwards. And that is a part of the food system that doesn't make any sense. And if we can address some of those issues, there's a lot of opportunities across for youth in that sector to be able to work in, to be able to increase food availability. So separate from the sovereignty issue, but just noting that there's food systems, and how we help support and empower actors throughout the system is really important too. Thanks.
Thanks, Anne. I think it may be time to open up the floor to the audience for questions. So I'll give you just a moment to collect your thoughts. We have a really rich conversation going on here. We also have a microphone going around. Any particular?
Thank you. Hi, thank you so much. My name is Ismini. I'm a second-year student here. I had a question for Tanya, but would love to open it up to the rest of the panel as well. I was really excited to hear about the Global Hub for Indigenous Peoples Food Systems that I think you mentioned came out of the UN Food Systems Summit in 2021, or maybe, maybe not. Okay, well, my question is connected to that Food Systems Summit as well. And this impression that, you know, it was kind of co-opted by the private sector, and a lot of these multinational food corporations kind of pushing their own agendas. And I'm curious about the role that you see these multinational corporations playing in this food sovereignty movement, in you know, really respecting and elevating Indigenous voices, and if they can effectively do it, and how to sort of safeguard that process. Clearly, a lot of them have made huge commitments and put a lot of resources towards at least saying they're going to do some initiatives around in this realm, and how can we sort of make sure that that redistribution of resources and power actually happens effectively?
So that's a really good and challenging question. So the Global Hub is a knowledge platform that emerged prior the UNA Food Systems Summit. And the idea is co-creation of knowledge. We ideally are trying to reach out Indigenous researchers, because I feel like there are many people already doing initiatives, but we just need to bring them together like a block. So I'm sorry I don't have slides, but there's a web page that is called Global Hub Indigenous Peoples Food System, FAO, and then you can reach out to us through there. You're doing something on Indigenous Peoples Food Systems. In relation to the UNA Food Systems Summit, precisely because we felt it was co-opted. With the Global Hub, what we did is write collectively, we pile a paper, that's how we called it, that it gathered 60 contributions from people around the world, which included oral and non-oral knowledge. And we used that as an advocacy paper to show what was the value of Indigenous people's food systems. Because at the pre-summit in Rome last year, the coalitions, which are like the final product, let's say, of the summit, there were only, if I recall right, like 6. And the rest were told to go to each of these coalitions. And many of us refused, including Indigenous peoples. And that's why we advocated for one, because if there was like a preset agenda, so what was the point of the whole summit, right? In the end, I think there were launched 33 coalitions, and now they are existing 28. We were not so sure if ours was going to survive. It seems like it's gonna survive. And part of what we want to do is, or if you look at the objectives of the coalition, like I said, we want to launch it next Tuesday. I will share the link if you're interested to see. Part of it is that we want to influence policy processes that are affecting our territories. And that means also I would say that's my take. It's not the official voice of the coalition. We have a secretariat, that's Tanya speaking. I feel like we could influence several policy processes. Like we have many organizations working in our territories and our governments, and I feel like one of the biggest opportunities for the coalition is precisely right guidelines on I was talking about the free, prior, informed consent in guiding people. How do we want them to work with us in our territories when it comes to food and nutrition security? I've been working with this group for nearly 2 years, and I was mentioning the ways of grabbing. When you see something physically built, like a dam or a railroad or something, you have something physical and tangible. And I feel like when it comes to policy influencing food and nutrition, it's not so tangible, or education when we talk about the different ways of knowledge. And that's why we still need to make more guidelines. And that doesn't ensure countries or governments are not going to respect them, but I feel like we have to move a step forward. I know many people was disappointed at the Food System Summit, but I still feel like we need to make space from different areas and try to work from different areas at the grassroots level inside the system and just give it a try.
We had a question in the back.
Yes, thank you. I have a question for USAID. You mentioned that helping farmers grow what they want to grow and how they like to grow it. Is there any effort to help them help themselves and how they grow it as well? Meaning not just let them grow however they'd like to grow.
No, 100%. And sorry if I wasn't clear before. I wanted to reiterate, I think in the food sovereignty conversation, we definitely want to that farmers should have a choice in how they do things. And one of the things I think we're trying to do, especially through the Feed the Future, is provide different options that include things like knowledge from extension services from government to different ways of doing irrigation. So you have options on how to do that, different types of varietals of seeds and some of that training. So everything that we've different farming practices, or looking and even saying this is a traditional farming practice, it works well. Why are we, how do we spread that or make sure it goes back to scale and goes back to other parts of a region, for example. So short answer is yes, and work with a lot of implementing partners, a lot of cooperatives, a lot of NGOs around the world who do this day in and day out and working with farming communities. And also, I would just note my personal pet peeve for climate smart agriculture. We need many of the practices are more laborious for women. So some of the things that we're continuing to push to is make sure that when we work with smallholders around the world, that we are taking a gendered lens to this and not causing and adding more work and burden on women. So so down to like the level of different types of practices that we can say, hey, this is an option, and it can help increase yield or fight pests, which is a growing problem because of climate change. So short answer is in a whole host of ways, and it's generally done through just how USAID works and Feed the Future works. It's done through our we call them implementing partners on the ground, and many of them are NGOs. Non-governmental organizations, and are working, again, as I noted before, in this localization agenda to try to make sure we're working more with local actors. And I'll try to drop in the chat here or have shared with the organizers sort of a new portal on our website that's highlighting easier ways to try to work with USAID so we can share, especially from local actors on the ground. So hope that answers the question.
We have a question over here. And then a few more in the front.
Buenos dias. Good morning. My name is Sochin, and I have a question for Tanya and Chica, right?
Yes.
Yes. So I want to share a personal story, and then I'll move on to my question. So a few years ago, I was having some health issues, and I recurred to a nutritionist to help me figure out what was going on and how to improve my diet. And one of the most condescending statements that she made towards my food diet, which is primarily indigenous Mexican food, is that that's not enough. You need to switch to the Mediterranean diet. And I created so much internal hate towards my food culture at the time that I believed her professional advice over my own cultural values and my family. And then that's when I realized that I'm not gonna let another person dictate how I should live my life without considering who I am first. And so since then, I've been attempting to decolonize my food palette and really build a stronger connection and relationship to my food, because that's what is really important to me. And so my question to you two is, what's one way that we as individuals can decolonize our minds within the Western food system?
Thank you for that question. And yeah, I'm really sorry about your experience with the nutritionist. That was a violation of your food sovereignty at a personal level. And that goes on at the community level, sometimes with what we call agricultural extension. And you were knowledgeable enough to stand your ground, to step back and say, no, my rights are being denied. This is not informed counsel from this nutritionist. So I would say a lot of people are not as knowledgeable as you, really. And I really wish I can say something else, but education, education, education. Formal education, informal, non-formal. What conversations are we having with our kids, with our friends, with what are we dropping on social media? We are educating people. And if we find ourselves in any kind of formal setting, what are we presenting? Non-formally, I have produced a couple of documentary films. It's the same thing. It's indigenous people, the right to know that there is so much misinformation out there, and that if you are not knowledgeable, you will get caught up in that misinformation, thinking that you are making progress, but at the end of the day, that is not what it is. So I'm not sure really, except to be informed and to inform others about the retrogression that is supposed to be progress, that is misconstrued as progress in many quarters, as far as the imposition of Western food system is concerned. And again, Western food system that has been left behind by the enlightened community in the Western world, who are now looking for solutions to the whole crisis, health crisis, environment crisis, but majority who are not informed are still towing that popular line. That would just be, I wish I had something else to say, but that's really my conviction. Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, I would say also I'm sorry about what you had to go through. And I think to me a lot, there's a picture I love of myself in the mountains, because I feel like when I was a little girl, I wonder what was beyond these mountains. And now I feel like I need to understand what's more inside these mountains, which is my homeland. I would agree in the sense that there's not so much understanding of these traditional food systems, and that's one of the reasons why I became a researcher. First, trying to understand from outside, now trying to understand from the inside. And I feel like a lot of the things that drive me are nostalgia for the life I had as a child in my community. But at the same time, this nostalgia, I mentioned that I love my work, it's advocacy so other people is aware that what we have inside our culture, our mountains, our valleys, it's worth it, it's valuable, and that we need to put that also in policy processes. I don't know how to answer exactly your question, but what I can tell you is like, maybe you can find some way of healing, also doing advocacy work for what you believe, like reclaiming. I love the US and Canada in the sense that they have many reclaiming strategies, because I feel like that's also what we need to be doing. We need to reclaim, not restore, reclaim in many cases. Thank you.
Good morning, and thank you to the panel for wonderful presentations. My question is to Anne, and what I'd like to know is, what is USAID doing to influence US policies that have undermined food sovereignty, especially in places like Puerto Rico, which imports, I think, 80% of their food, and Haiti, which is where I come from originally, which imports 90% of its food, and where a lot of it is also coming from the Dominican Republic. And there has been enormous loss of sovereignty in Haiti, especially during the last 40, 50 years.
Yeah, really good question. And apologize in advance. I probably won't give as full of an answer as because we work overseas, but recognize that trade obviously matters and impacts food security around the world if we have a trading system that operates in different ways. So just in terms of some of the things I think the US government has done, there's been the USDA has changed some of its, has been doing some interesting thing on its policies lately. I'll try to put in the chat, but we predominantly work overseas in countries trying to help food security in other countries. And in terms of, for example, Puerto Rico, I can't speak to Puerto Rico and what our policies are, but in terms of working, in Haiti, there's been what happened with rice in Haiti was pretty dramatic back in the 90s, if you recall, as I'm sure you've had to live through. So I think some of the things that we try to do is work on policies in countries to make sure that they are as robust as possible, and that national governments are able to work and create policies that are good for their own people. And can try to drop in the chat some links to other parts of the government that work on global trade, if that helps. And sorry, that's probably not the most fulsome answer. Over.
Thanks, Anne. I think we had a question in the middle in the front, and then a couple on the left-hand side, my left-hand side. Do we know where the microphone is? Have we got a mic? Up here in the front, please.
Thank you. Good morning. My name is Zoe. I'm a first-year student here. Thank you for all coming today. I was curious to know, I think, to what extent is informing and enlightening the masses, as you said, not enough? Because I feel like the symbolic violence is a product of colonialism. There's a broad, big middle-class groups of people who are very resistant. And I'm wondering, to what extent is unmasking, as Marx would say, or enlightening not enough? Because there's so much entrenched symbolic violence.
Maybe I should ask you a question. What do you think we can do?
I honestly don't know.
Outside of violence. And that's why you're here to study, because you want a better life for yourself, right? And you took a choice, made a choice to come here. And it seems like a tragedy going on, and we're just watching that tragedy unfold. But the truth is, we can't fight. There's nothing, the weapon we have is knowledge. I think things are really improving with the internet and social media. There's a situation in Nigeria with the wheat crisis. A baker, a lady baker in a rural area came up with potato bread, and it's selling like hotcake. So she said, okay, I can't close my bakery down, but she started to think and experiment with indigenous foods. And she came up with this potato that grows indigenously in her community. And she began to use it to make bread. She would just boil it, mash it, add a little flour to it, add some flour to it, not a little, but then it was much more cheaper and nutritious. And she said diabetics began to recover. Diabetics who previously ate white processed wheat bread, but started to eat that, began to get better, and other diseases. And so she got funding from the International Potato Association of something? Center, yes, IPC. So she's training hundreds of bakers in Nigeria today. And thanks to social media, she is popularizing that, food. So still knowledge is what we have to work with. It's not going to happen overnight, I'm afraid, but it will happen if we consistently keep putting that knowledge out there in wherever we find ourselves. So that would be one way of, and I understand what you're saying, because institutions like the World Bank, which have worked with the World Bank in Africa, is really very slow in adopting this knowledge system in terms of promoting it. A situation that I gave, an example I gave in a TED talk I gave some years back. In Niger Republic, a land that is a desert land, the World Bank invested millions of dollars in trying to get irrigation, to irrigate some of the land there, but that didn't work. And then some local farmers came up with this indigenous irrigation system, ZAI, and said, we were using it in the past, it worked for us, but you came with your own system, you've invested so much money, has not worked, and we are indebted to you, we borrowed money for that. Can we now go back and try our own indigenous system? And they did try it, they went back and tried it, and it worked, produced much more food, tons of food, much more than whatever they could have accomplished with the World Bank funds. So again, knowledge and insisting on that will be the slow but steady climb towards that sovereignty and hopefully reversal that we need.
Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah.
We've got some questions on this side. And I think in the front has been waiting first. Oh, good, thanks.
I have a question for Anne, and also I would love to hear Chika's input. Is there any lessons that USAID has learned from the Alliance for Green Revolution in Africa? And considering that some scholars have argued that this has negative connotations for the environment regarding like acidification of soils and they argue that there has been negative connotations. Are there any lessons that USAID is trying to implement? And also I would love to hear Chika's impact in or output on the impact that AGRA has had in Nigeria. Thank you.
No, thanks. Good question. There's been a series of evaluations on AGRA over the years. Most recently, one that came out just a couple months ago, six months ago, maybe a little bit more. And our monitoring and evaluation experts here look closely at that evaluation to look at lessons learned and both what worked, some things that have worked, and then some things that haven't, and have had conversations with AGRA to see how we can learn and grow from that, because we need to learn from our from the interventions that we have. And we also sent out some really good staff to dig into some of these questions earlier this year too. So 100%, I think we're trying to look at learnings from all of our programs. Frankly, they have the need is so great to make sure that we've talked about some of the numbers of hungry people around the world that are only growing because of conflict, climate, and the COVID that's still impacting and ravaging many communities around the world. So we need to be as efficient and effective as possible as we move forward in working on our food security issues, or frankly, all of our development dollars. So I think we want to encourage continued learning, but that can also drop into the chat some of the evaluations that have happened over the last year plus. Thanks.
Yeah, thank you. I think Anne answered, the question. I just want to add that we need to look beyond the numbers. Quantitatively, yes, perhaps when fertilizers introduced in bulk quantities, it resulted in such and such tonnage. But what effect qualitatively, when we look at the quality, what effect did it have on the soil, on the environment? And 5 years down the line, are we still going to produce that much bumper harvest? Or do we go back to records and understand that after some years, it starts declining, in terms of productivity, and declines to an extent where even indigenous knowledge of, land recovery will not work anymore on those lands. So rather than this euphoria that lasts 3, 4, 5 years about how successful something has been, and then the next decade we're talking of hunger again in the same community, we will go for the sustained the method of ensuring food security, and not just short-lived to give credit to a particular administration, a particular CEO at some point, but qualitatively over long term, what is the effect on the people, on the land, on the environment? Yeah, thank you.
Hi. Thank you to the panelists. My name is Susan Marks. I'm a human rights practitioner with the Carter Center. I am not a food security expert, though I take a human rights approach to this and to climate justice in general and to food security. So I think, first of all, just a recognition of the amazing progress in this field. If we have, women representing Mexico, Nigeria, and Tajikistan on a panel, I think in and of itself is progress, okay, talking about these issues. Something that's missing to me in the discussion, however, is two things. This came up with our colleague talking about the decolonization of food and the advice people are getting about, what they should eat, this perpetuation of, a desire to eat junk food, as I heard you say. I've lived in some of the poorest countries in the world, including conflict zones, where you see that. It's looked down upon for people to eat their indigenous foods, rather than eating, local food. They want to eat Lay's chips or anything in a packet, and it shows wealth, and it shows that, you've succeeded and so forth. And so while I think it's very important to decolonize the palate and go back to indigenous food sources and a recognition and a respect from a fundamental human rights perspective, collectively, for me, the only way that we can change either global food system or climate justice is recognizing power imbalance, is recognizing that there is a fundamental power imbalance when it's cheaper to buy imported food, when you can buy maize in Kenya cheaper than you can grow it. And so how do we address that other than with collective action, which I think is what the indigenous communities today are, coming together and fighting together in collective action. But then if you look at what's happening at COP27 now, Egypt is shutting down human rights groups that talk about hard issues. There is a fundamental power imbalance, and until we can address the big 5 countries or whoever is causing all the damage to the environment, we can talk about growing potatoes the way our grandmothers used to do it, or whatever the case may be. So what advice do you as food activists and indigenous communities have to ensuring that information asymmetry and imbalance is addressed? How are we brave? How do we be brave and stand up against? I think if we want to change something, the United States should, tax its big corporations. It needs to come out with legislation, Yeah, that's my frustration as a human rights person. Where's the tipping point?
I think we tragically have less than 60 seconds to tackle this very important question. So I'll let the panelists do what they can.
My goal is we have to disrupt the system in many ways as we can. And I was at COP26, and I was with a delegation of land defenders from Guatemala and Central America. And I can tell you truly that what I enjoyed the most about COP26 wasn't the official meetings, was what happened on the streets. Because that's when we create solidarities. But that also means that we can find allies within the system. I'm not an anti-pro system at all, but I feel like we need to be building solidarities from different spaces, arenas, and working together. I still believe in collective action, and we need to disrupt narratives. And this is why it's important that we are here.
Mm-hmm. Please help me thank our panelists for this wonderful conversation.
I'll just echo that thanks. This conversation was so inspiring and energizing. I appreciate you all being here and bringing your perspectives and discussing this very important topic.
Thank you.
I have a few announcements to make before we go to our next sessions. So the breakout sessions will start at 11 a.m. So that's in just about 15 minutes. Please make your way down there right away. The bathrooms are on every floor. So if you find there's some queuing, just find another floor and you'll find one very quickly. There's also volunteers around if you're looking for something and need some help. So the breakout sessions, the legal dimensions of climate migration is right here in Burke. Feel free to do what you need to do, take a break and come right back in, or you can just stay in the room. And then we have a couple of guides who will stand in the back to lead you if you're going to one of the other breakout sessions. The breakout session for humanitarian assistance is in Bowers. That's the building right next door. So you'll need to walk out of this building. And Dorji in the back is waving. He'll take you over to Bowers. So find him and he'll have the door open for you. All of the buildings are not allowed to be green lit yet. So we'll try to make sure that we have someone at the doors to let you in, but then follow the signs and you'll find Burke Auditorium. Ezak, thank you, is in the back. Ezak will lead you all the way down to G01. It's basically straight down the stairs, but then there's a little loop-de turn before you go to the basement. And there are several sets of double doors. So if you're wondering why there's another set of double doors, just keep going through it and eventually you'll arrive in a classroom. So that's G01. So I also wanted to say, after breakouts, we'll return to the 3rd floor for lunch. So you can all meet back here at noon for lunch. And our next main session in Burke Hall will start at 1 p.m. Just as a reminder, we do ask that during sessions, while sessions are in session, please remain masked. So as you go to your breakouts, if you need a mask, we have them at the registration desk, but please remember to remain masked while sessions are in session. And thank you for coming. We will see you at the breakouts.
Thank you, Tanya. That was awesome.